Hello everyone, this is Kat. Welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. This will be the continuation of Deku and Death. This will be part 31, chapter 31, entitled The State in Which We Leave This World. The remaining week before the sports festival flew by before Midoriya knew it. He wished he'd had more breathing time, but surprisingly he was feeling pretty good about today, more so than he thought he would, today being the day of the UA Sports Festival. The front entrance of the school had been absolutely swarmed by reporters and journalists, even more than in previous years. If he had to guess, it would have to be because of his class. Surviving a villain attack brings in more publicity than he would have liked. Thankfully, Aizawa had already set up an entry point for the students, so no one had to attempt to traverse the mass that was outside. Midoriya slinked inside and subsequently into the empty classroom. He had some time before the rest of the class filed in, so he stood aimlessly by the window, staring out into the void of bustling newscasters. He definitely had a profound appreciation for people that were watching, much more than he expected was normal, though he supposed it came with the job. Hidden between shoving reporters and overeager fans, he could definitely spot some heroes mixed in. It was easy to forget that their performance was not only being watched by the world, but the very heroes that would eventually hire them. Their very futures would be watching, and it only took one small moment to either make or break them. If he looked at it like that, everyone had a chance for their dreams to become realities, but then again, everyone had a chance to watch their dreams crumble away into nothing. Yeah. Did he say he was feeling good? Because who was he kidding? He was nervous as hell. He couldn't stand still, bouncing on his heels just to keep himself busy. He had his arms wrapped around his sides, trying to contain his bundle of overactive nerves. His heart hammered in his chest. So much was riding on today. So much was riding on his success. He couldn't afford to fail. Not after how far he'd already made it. The empty room suddenly became very suffocating. He was beginning to drown himself in nerves and his thoughts. It was one of the few circumstances where he could hate being alone. Except he wasn't, and that made it all the worse. Gami stood beside him, rambling on about the people below in an attempt to override the thoughts that he knew his successor was thinking. The ghost watched the clock intensely, wondering if the minutes could tick by any faster. Though he was overwhelmed with this strange sense of hopelessness as he did, he felt so incredibly sad at watching the time pass by and unsuccessfully hoping that it would pass faster, and he had no idea why. He knew that he should have told Midori about the feeling, but he didn't want to worry the teen any more before his big day, so instead he turned to watch the door for Aizawa. The hero had probably left to chat with Yamada, but honestly it was as much of a gamble of where he was as to when he would return. So the duo stood there, listening to the sounds of muffled reporters and of time passing by, all while Gami aimlessly talked over it all. Surprisingly, even amongst the nervousness, the casual aura of peace could be felt. It was absolutely amazing how calm they could be in each other's company, state of the world aside. It would always be the two of them, to the end of the world and back, and that brought a surprising amount of harmony to their lives. And then it was no longer just the two of them. One by one, Midoriya's classmates trickled into the room, leaving the boy to seek refuge and solitude at his desk. Not everyone was nervous. Certainly not as nervous as he was, but they all held that same air of anticipation, and regardless, it was not helping Midoriya in any way. Uraraka walked in looking especially frazzled, and he didn't even need a small push from Gami to get up and go talk to her, if just to ease his own worries. Still, the ghost gave it to him anyway, nudging his shoulder purposefully. Midoriya rolled his eyes, but made sure to accidentally bump into him as he stood from his seat. Gami didn't mind at all. In fact, it was a relief to see this lightheartedness shine through, considering how nervous he was before. "Ah, Midori!" Uraraka met him halfway, the two of them stopping between desks and other classmates. "Can you believe the crowd outside?" "Yeah." He unconsciously glanced over to the window he was previously staring out of. "Sure is intimidating." Wrong choice of words, apparently, as the girl seemed to only get more worked up. "I don't know if I can do this." But just as he was about to backtrack and try to de-escalate both of their nerves, someone else started for him, though absolutely scaring the pants off of them in the process. "What happened to the pumped-up Uraraka from before?" Ida popped in from behind them, neither of which noticed him walk in at all. "Saying how you were going to crush this." Ida!" she exclaimed, and Midori had to stop his own heart from jumping out of his chest. "Well, I know, but there's just so much riding on today. What if I mess up or I don't do good?" "Hey," Midoriya decided to jump in. You said it before. We're here to do our best, so let's just give it our all, and whatever happens next, we'll figure it out together. Yeah, that was right. All he could do was give it his best. He wanted to give a performance that he could be proud of, so that's what he was going to do. Precisely, Ida agreed. If you go into this already doubting yourself, then you'll have no expectations to improve, but I know you, Uraraka, and I have full confidence that you will do great. So have confidence in yourself. Yeah, he could do this. There were people who had confidence in him already. He couldn't let them down. He had to be confident in himself, too. I meant what I said when we first met. Quirk or not, you're going to be a great hero one day, Midoriya. Unless you explicitly tell me that you don't want to do this, I won't stop you. Gami gave him a quick nod. He could feel his eyes burn with a new level of determination. Uraraka wiped softly at her eyes. Thanks, guys. I feel a lot better now. Let's do this. Midoriya felt a lot better, too. The boys nodded enthusiastically. That's the spirit. His friends continued to lightheartedly chat, but there was something else that the teen had in mind in the dwindling time that was left. He looked back behind him, and sure enough, Todoroki had slinked his way to the desk amidst the relative chaos. Between the 2 weeks from the USJ incident and today, they'd talked back and forth, but Midoriya couldn't help but notice that his friend seemed a bit withdrawn. Even from messages alone, he could tell the air had shifted. It worried him, and from what he knew about Todoroki, it had every right to. He hoped it was just nerves about the sports festival like everyone else. He didn't think so, but he hoped. So he retreated from Uraraka and Ida and slinked back himself, moving amongst the crowds of his classmates so he didn't draw too much attention. The only person to notice was Gami, who drifted close behind, and with some fancy maneuvers and a little bit of sidestepping, they both successfully made it to the back of the room. The anxiety in Midoriya's stomach began to grow when he approached the side of Todoroki's desk without a single reaction. His friend simply stared out into the crowd lifelessly, and he'd be lying if he said it didn't unnerve him. For a moment he was unsure whether to say anything at all, fighting the off-putting vibe that flooded him, but he figured it was much more awkward to just stand beside him without saying anything. Hey, Shoto, he said quietly, though it was more drowned out by the rest of the class. How are you feeling about the sports festival? He waited a moment, and then another, but the longer he waited in silence, the more his stomach started to sink. The breath in his lungs froze like ice, piercing his chest. Surely Todoroki simply hadn't heard him. Maybe he was simply lost in thought, absent to the outside world. That happened to Midoriya often enough. What else was he supposed to think after being effectively ignored? That it was purposeful? I mean, I was pretty nervous earlier, he rambled on, much like Gami had before. But now I'm actually feeling kind of good about everything, maybe a little excited even. He laughed half-heartedly to himself, hoping that would lighten the mood, but as the silence droned on, his hopes diminished. Dread pulled in his gut all over again. Surely Todoroki just hadn't heard him. Surely he wasn't being ignored. His stomach absolutely dropped as he watched Todoroki turn away from him, choosing to face a different direction entirely. His mouth ran dry as his current breath hitched in his throat. He couldn't stop the stunned glance to his mentor, just to make sure that he wasn't crazy. But with the look Gami gave him, he wasn't sure how to feel. So Todoroki was really ignoring him. But why? Had he done something wrong? He was about to unconsciously step back, but stopped himself. Should he just move away? Why would it look weird? Should he press him for more? Should he just sit back down at his desk that was still uncomfortably beside him? He didn't know what to do, and the longer he just stood there awkwardly, the more his heart pounded. He'd felt so comfortable around Todoroki. The only other people that he'd been close to were Gami and Ishihara. People he'd known for years, so to have that ripped away from him, it made him feel so vulnerable. Gami moved to shield his successor from the other, not that it really mattered since he couldn't be seen in the first place. The three remained in this tense standoff, one out of shock, one out of anger, and one unknown. And unless one of them changed, none of them were going to. All right. Aizawa walked into the classroom, startling everyone into silence. Upon having everyone's attention, he called them to follow with a wave of his hand. Let's get this show on the road. Impeccable timing as usual, and Midori didn't hesitate to remove himself from the situation. His newfound confidence took a steep dive as his shakiness that he was so used to returned. Once again everything felt like too much, and composure seemed far from reach, so he simply followed the crowd of his classmates, blankly, avoiding anyone who he thought would try to talk to him until he could get this heaviness from him. Eventually, he, along with everyone else, found themselves outside the locker rooms that they used for heroics. Aizawa gestured to each door respectively. Once you're done changing into your uniforms, head straight to the prep room down the hall. You won't miss it. And then he walked off, leaving everyone to their own devices as suddenly the weight of today crashed down. Midoriya barely avoided the stampede of his own classmates as they rushed into the locker rooms. It took him more willpower than he thought he had to avoid falling onto an autopilot, but to avoid letting the emptiness take hold of him like he was so used to. Because as much as feeling less made him feel better, pushing away his consciousness wasn't going to help. It never did. He promised he was going to change, and he wasn't about to fall through on it now. It was easier than usual to slink away into one of the bathroom stalls with his uniform, but that was obviously because of all the hype. He swallowed some deep breaths, clenching his hands in a desperate attempt to feel more. Then Gami spoke for what felt like the first time in ages. "It is unfortunate that you could not wear your costume instead." "Yeah," the teen wiggled out of his shirt. "But they're not allowed in the interest of fairness. Not all students have a hero costume, remember?" "I suppose you're correct." The playful disappointment in his voice was evident, and Midoriya couldn't help but roll his eyes in a sarcastic way that friends did. But the sentiment left him thinking, unable to truly get away from his own overwhelming thoughts. This festival was never truly fair. As much as UA tried to make it so, the hero students would always have an advantage over everyone else, and it was so obvious that those were the contestants that everyone really came to see. The animosity of the other classes suddenly hit him to its truest extent. Nothing about life was fair. He knew that just as well as anyone, maybe even more. But that didn't stop the sourness that came anyway. It was always too easy to be angry. He finished fastening his sweatpants, but it made him more unsatisfied than anything else. "Hey, Gami." It barely came out as a breath, so quiet it could have gone unnoticed. "Yes, but it didn't." Would you be opposed if I asked you not to interfere with today?" The ghost paused, caught off guard completely. The disappointment was apparent to them both, but he did his best to push it down anyways. I do not understand." They both knew he did. "It's nothing against you, really, but—" He reiterated, something evident, though the uncertainty remained. "Not everyone's lucky enough to have someone like you. I don't want this to be any more unfair than it already is." Gami shuffled, caught between what he knew was right and what he wanted. "Besides, I need to do this myself. I need to prove that I'm still meant to be here." He ignored how selfish it sounded. Thankfully, Gami understood. He was so lucky because Gami always understood. "All right, if that is what you wish." He hesitated. Can we still talk in between?" Midoriya smiled and slugged him playfully in the shoulder. "Of course, silly." And then things became a bit lighter after that. He finished with a haste, realizing his loss of time, and upon exiting the stall he groaned. Of course he was the last one left. He could only hope that he wasn't being waited on, so he walked a bit with more pep in his step than he was truly feeling, leaving the locker room to look for the prep room as well. Aizawa was right as always. There was no way anyone could miss the room with the obnoxious 1A prep room sign out front. Sucking in a breath and his insecurities, he flashed a grin to his mentor before giving the door handle a slow twist. Inside was a cacophony of anxiousness and anticipation, chatter echoing off the walls, still air despite vibration voices. It was loud and chaotic, but it allowed Midoriya to slip in unnoticed, or so he thought. He took the brief moment to try and collect himself, to calm the racing in his chest. Midoriya. Hearing his name pierced any kind of concentration that he'd managed to gather, though hearing it in Todoroki's voice shook him more than he would ever admit. All the conversation in the room stilled as heads turned toward the two of them. Midoriya didn't bother moving from his spot, not sure if he even could, even if he could will his legs to do so. With all eyes on him, he swallowed his weakness and pushed forth a false bravado. "Hey, what is it?" Obviously it wasn't perfect. Even still, Todoroki was unfazed, and the sheer indifference in his glare twisted something fragile inside of him. "Objectively speaking, I'm stronger than you, more capable." A jolt ran down his spine, and he tried his best to hide the trembling of his hands. He didn't understand, and so there was nothing to buffer the hurt in his heart. It just stung, just like the ugly scars that covered his skin. He wanted to claw it out of him, to tear himself apart completely until it was gone. He could hear history laughing at him. What a fool he was and always had been. "All Might's got his eye on you, doesn't he?" Midoriya tried to interject, but was beaten to the punch. Now, I'm not about to pry into why that is, but... Todoroki was way too observant for his own good. He'd only began speaking to All Might 2 weeks ago, much too assuming as well. "I will beat you." He wasn't sure that his soul could be wrung out any further, but it was. Reactions were mixed, as expected. It was a room full of high schoolers, after all. "Ooh," Kaminari commented brazenly. "A declaration of war from the strongest in the class?" "Hey, man, why pick a fight now?" Kirishima rushed to his aid, reaching for Todoroki's shoulder. "We're about to go on." Gami couldn't help but agree, starting to grow upset. "Look, I understand you value his prior companionship, but do not let him trample you as such." Midori didn't even have a chance to process it, as Todoroki violently shrugged off Kirishima's hand. "I really don't care." The venom in his voice had him recoiling. "I'm not pretending to be anyone's friend." He wasn't sure that his soul could be wrung out any further, but it was. Kirishima desperately tried to do some damage control, but Midori had long tuned it out. To humor his thoughts, something was terribly wrong, and the panic that came from not knowing was overwhelming. His mind raced through the past weeks, wondering if he'd done something unintentional. Todoroki's words bit savagely with such ruthlessness it almost seemed like he was intentionally disregarding their prior friendship, if he could even call it that by now. Was that what he wanted? To throw it away? He looked down at his hands, which he had clenched to hide their shaking. It would be so easy to regard this development as final. To retreat back into himself and lick his wounded pride. Why would he want to keep himself open, to keep his vulnerability unguarded? Why would he want to allow himself the chance to be hurt again? His mind recalled his experience with All Might. He had been so wounded, disregarded as a person, closing himself off, and kept him safe from hurt for so long. But it also had soured him, left him bitter with resentment, left him just like who he'd been hurt by, and he realized that was wrong, that he was wrong to run away from the things that hurt him, wrong to use that as justification to hurt others. It wasn't that Todoroki knew about the things that troubled him, his insecurities or the fears that he'd buried so deep inside him. It wasn't that they were similar in upbringing, in sufferings or in emotional loneliness. It wasn't even that it was the righteous thing to do. Just as he knew when he'd been hurt, he knew when to continue and when to fall back, and this time he continued because he cared. He pushed aside the hurt because he cared. He valued their companionship, the one that they had shared, the authenticity emanated from their words, and the true freedom he had felt in his presence. Todoroki was his friend, and he wouldn't give up on that. "I'm not sure why you felt the need." His voice came out, rusty and old, groaning like an abused door hinge. "To tell me that you'll beat me." He could only wonder, and wondering wasn't good for his head, so he didn't. "You're clearly stronger, and I can't measure up to most of the others here." His shoulders scrunched up to his neck. "Objectively speaking, even." "Don't be so negative, Midori." Kirishima tried to derail his pessimistic train of thought, which, of course, offered his ghostly mentor the opportunity to interject as well, but he held up a hand to stop them both. "But everyone, even the kids from other courses, are aiming for the top." He was reminded of the kid from General Studies and the declaration he made outside the classroom door. "And I'm going for it too, with everything I've got." He would give it his all. That's what he committed to before, and he was sticking with it now. Everything was always so much greater than himself, and for that he wouldn't allow anything less than his best. He promised that he would hold firm. He looked up for the first time, fiercely meeting Todoroki's cold, distant eyes with his own challenge. "I'll see you there." First up, the miraculous rising stars who brushed off a villain attack with their steely willpower. You know who I'm talking about. The first years of the hero course. Geez, with an intro like that, there wasn't a lot of wiggle room. Still, he breathed in for what might possibly be the last time today, and tried to remain professional and composed as the field doors opened and the bright lights blinded him. He stepped out along with his peers. How did he end up at the front of the crowd? "It's Class 1A!" He wasn't sure what was louder, present mic over the intercom, or the rush of audience applause and ecstatic cheers. Regardless, there was no shot of hearing his thoughts over the noise. He couldn't hear his heartbeat in his ears like he usually did. Only the hammering in his ribcage proved it was still there. He had to fight to keep his hand from grasping at the cramp inside. What a crowd! "And we're expected to put on the best performance that we can in front of so many spectators." Ida approached from behind, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I suppose this is merely one more necessary skill if we hope to become heroes." And then there was another touch, one colder, more bony. "Do not falter now. You are more than capable of doing this." Tell that to his nerves. "Following Class B, it's Classes C, D, and E of General Studies." And the teacher had blared over the microphone. Midori watched as the respective students entered the field. "And now for the support courses, F, G, and H. And the business course." The voice droned out as Midori lost it to his own thoughts, gathering around the center stage along with everyone else. Upon its creaky wooden boards, Midnight stood bored, waiting for the other to finish with the theatrics. Her signature flogger-style whip had rested on her hip, bouncing around impatiently. He guessed that she was their referee for today. Each year got assigned one. Nezzy was always third year, but first and second got switched around often. All the chatter ceased as a crack tore through the air, followed by a black blur and the rattle of handcuffs. When everyone's attention on her, Midnight had strolled up to the edge and daintily, with just enough sway to accentuate her hair and hips. Should she truly be in a high school? Midori sent a half-hearted shrug. Sure, Midnight wasn't his shining example of a model hero, but she got the job done. She kept people safe, she put villains behind bars, and that's what mattered. "Now, for the athlete's oath," she announced with a smile and another wave of her whip. Oh, yeah, that. He hadn't forgotten. Well, sort of. It was always on his mind, surfacing now as a common thought whenever his head reeled him back in, but it was always so much easier to push those thoughts aside in favor of training or grounding himself amongst the noise. But it wasn't like he hadn't known that this moment would come. "I'm pleased to welcome your student representative," though it wasn't like he exactly had anything prepared either. "From Class 1A, Midori Izuku." His classmates turned to him in shock, and who could blame them? It wasn't like he broadcasted this out to the whole world. He was lucky that he knew about it before today. He really wouldn't put it past Nezu to keep this from another student, just to watch them squirm on the podium. Students parted like the sea, and it left Midori feeling inadequate, for lack of a better word. He was just a kid, just like them, but amongst a void of disbelieving and even resentful eyes, he couldn't feel more different on the other end of the spectrum. He started a slow walk to the steps, just trying to ignore hushed murmurs and the overwhelming air of bitterness to keep it from invading his already poisoned thoughts. It was true, he didn't have any sort of speech prepared. Normally that kind of uncertainty would leave him as much of a nervous wreck than he currently was portraying, but this time was more of an anomaly. He really sat on this for a while. Slow-cooked it in his head ever since Nezu had shocked him with the news. This kind of thing, it didn't feel like it was meant to be a pre-written speech that had been hashed through his harsh critique of his own bias for days on end. Straightening himself in front of the mic, the teen realigned himself for good measure. He locked eyes with Gami, who waited in the crowd. The ghost gave him an enthusiastic thumbs up, a double, and that forced a small smile from him. If he could make sure of anything, of which he had a very low track record, it was that this was as genuine as he could possibly make it. This was his chance, the first of hopefully many to really do some good, because that's what he set out to do the moment he met Gami, the moment that he started training for the entrance exam, the moment he got accepted into the nation's most accredited high school for heroes. Maybe it wasn't what he was meant to do. If he went by the nature of his being, the touch that resided under his fingertips, but it was what he was going to do. He was more than the power that brewed inside of him. He was more than the sum of his parts. They all were. "I think." The voice that came out startled him. He almost didn't recognize it, the level of grip and grit practically unknown to him. Was this strength, confidence, or something else entirely? "I think too often the world tries to tell us who we're meant to be, and I think that more often than that we all live our lives believing it." Whispers pretended to die down in the wake of his words, but he knew better. They would always be there, toying with everything that they thought he knew. Who was he to preach about fate when it tugged around his neck like a leash, and led him like a dog, starved him, casted him aside, and then expected him to curl around its lap afterwards? It was true, the pull around his throat never got any looser, it never would, but he'd just keep fighting it until it broke. Because he was more than a sum of parts. He was more than some stuck-up hero student. He was more than just destined for death. He was more than what fate tried to claim him to be. "It's true. You're here for a reason, but it's up to you what you want that reason to be." Just because the world gave him instructions didn't mean that he had to follow them. No one could stop him from using a box mix to make a damn good cake without water and oil. "Don't let anyone convince you that the true you isn't who you are." His voice boomed from inside his lungs, echoing to something greater than himself, and with a role like his, it always was. Even the little blessings like Ishihara, the things he held close, they were always meant to be shared. He was lucky enough to have people to guide him, to teach him, but of course that wasn't everyone. It wasn't his duty, but the duty he'd given himself. "Every day we have the chance to leave our truest mark upon the world." With a newfound surge of vibrancy, he yanked the microphone off the stand, raising it to his lips with a bravado that no longer seemed false. "Let's start today." There was a moment of silence where Midoriya's heart stopped, where the whispers wormed their way past his defenses. Maybe this wasn't for him. He wasn't some idol. There were better examples to be looked up to. The doubt he'd pushed back was starting to be pulled over his eyes. And then his heart was startled back to life by the absolute roar that answered. The eruption was unmistakably led by his own class. Hearing hollers of fire and life sparked by his words, fists were raised like the drunken celebrations of war, the stands vibrating with excitement. He couldn't help the goofy smile that stretched upon his face, weaving the humanity into it all. He was just a kid, just like them. He stepped down calmly, moving back to his spot among his classmates. He returned wide grins with small smiles of his own, but made no effort to comment on anything. He merely spoke what was necessary, words of experience, not some heavenly graces of the universe. He didn't even flinch at the cold pressure at his back. He would be very proud. He hoped so. He wondered if he was still looking down on him after everything, after all this time. He really, really hoped so. "Just make sure to remember your biggest fan when you go pro." "Got it, Ishihara-san." "Now, without delay," Midnight picked up, "let's get the first event started." Suddenly, the large screen behind her lit up in a static, buzzing to life with sharp, crisp crackle, a roulette of the typical events lined up, then beginning to spin around as the randomizer processed. "These are the qualifiers. It's here that so many are sent home crying every year." Midoriya shuddered. She couldn't make that sound any less sadistic. "And the fateful first event this year is—" The mess on the screen stopped abruptly, and, along with everyone's breaths, "This!" In big, bold lettering, the words "obstacle course race" were shown. "She could have just said that," Gami remarked sarcastically. But before Midoriya could agree with him, the gates were then opened and clacking together, unlocking a series of overcomplicated clasps only fitting for UA's extravagance, and he turned to stare in awe. Just like everyone else, he couldn't help but feel small in comparison. As much as he knew how everyone would always be greater than himself, the shock that came from being reminded never got any easier to swallow. "A race between every member of all 11 classes," Midnight described in full detail. "The course is a 4-kilometer lap around the stadium itself." Goodness, amongst everyone, there had to be at least 200 students competing. Surely there weren't 200 spots to qualify, though. "Our school preaches freedom in all things," she interrupted her thought to laugh, once again sending a shudder down the teen's spine. "So long as you don't go off course, anything is fair game." Gami sent a pleading look at the teen, but he wouldn't even consider it. He was sure UA's definition of anything did not include a sentient, invisible, untouchable, essentially extra set of hands that could help his progress and impede others. And before his devil's advocate could remind him of Dark Shadow, he reminded it that Dark Shadow was not only visible and hinderable, but registered to all of UA's staff. So with only the stern look in his eye, Gami knew there was truly no fighting it. He sighed, but regardless, he followed his successor to the starting area, along with everyone else. "Racers, to your positions." When he watched Midoriya lower himself to a running position from outside the starting area tunnel, he knew it was time to go. "I will not procrastinate any longer." He finally caved in as the crowd grew thicker. Ding! The lights overhead flashed red. The ghost looked up, then through the dark tunnel and towards the light at the end of it. He let out a low chuckle, which caught Midoriya's attention despite his efforts to stay focused. "You best bet I shall be watching from the sidelines, however." Gami waved off the stands where everyone else sat. "I would much rather be up close and personal, you know." At that, Midoriya couldn't help but crack a smile. Ding! The overhead lights were flashing yellow. "I suppose that's my cue. I am so very proud of you." He began floating off, but stopped to give one cheesy mock salute. "Do kick ass, as it is said." And before he knew it, his mentor was gone, really truly gone, and yet he felt so much colder than when his undead presence was nearby. Was he nervous? Of course he was nervous. He wouldn't be human if he wasn't. But there were people he wanted to make proud. One of them told him to kick some ass. Ding! The lights overhead flashed green. Just watch him. "Start!" And the floodgates opened. Masses of students pushed and shoved in an attempt to get through it and to the starting of the tunnel. Midoriya, too, fueled by nothing more than determination. dodged stray elbows, and weaved his way past the stampede, and with a sufficient space outside the tunnel, it was working fairly well. But upon entering the underpass, he realized a critical issue. The starting gate was much too narrow for everyone to fit, and the rush of competition was too much of a compulsion to think otherwise. He was being crushed against other students, and by the shouts and cries around him, he wasn't the only one. Too many people, too close. His senses were overwhelmed. He needed to think. He needed a plan. This was the first test. But before he could do more than register the piggish squeals of Minetta behind him, a stark crack had rushed from the exit of the tunnel, along with a chill colder than he had ever felt. He suddenly found himself unable to move, though it didn't take a genius to figure out why. His shins to his toes were covered in a thin yet sturdy layer of ice, leaving him rooted to the ground, and based on similar cries of despair and discomfort, he wasn't the only one. He could hear his classmates pull ahead from the frozen crowd, and he was flooded with determination not to be left behind. With a grunt, he yanked off one of his gloves, stuffing it securely into his pocket before firmly planting his bare palm onto the ice below. And with his own deafening crack, he was free. The ice turning to mere flakes of what it once was, along with a little bit of his sweat-pant cuffs, too. There were shouts around him, begging him to do the same with all the ice, and for a moment he nearly did, but this was the competition, not a friendly scrimmage, and he promised someone that he'd see him at the top. He decayed a good patch of ice around his footing, and just to secure some extra traction before summoning his scythe in one hand. He didn't need a running start, but he had just enough space for one, and it gave him just enough of a boost to stick into the end of the ground and vault himself over the rest of the frozen crowd. He smirked upon landing, and recalled his weapon back to wherever it went when he wasn't using it. He was getting pretty good at that. He raced forward, tailing behind some of his classmates. It was no shocker to see many of the members of Class 1A so far ahead. Their instincts were impeccably fine-tuned, especially after the USJ. They had seen danger firsthand, and they all knew how important those few seconds just before were. He passed some more of his peers. There was no doubt in his mind that Todoroki led the pack, if that ice display had anything to say about it, and the thought pushed his steps even further. Something blurred in the corner of his vision, fast-moving and headed straight for him, but it all seemed to move in slow motion, leaving him easily able to curve out of the way of a giant robot fist that decimated the space that he was just at. He noticed some students, namely Minetta, that were rocketed toward the edges of the track, having been completely caught off guard and slugged by that machine. His own body had shuddered instinctually at the sheer amount of force that must have been exerted. A familiar hum had started up as the robots recalibrated, and sure enough, those giant robots were belonging to the faux villains from the heroics entrance exam. New priority: do not get hit by those things. Every obstacle, of course, needs some obstacles. President Mike's voice had blared over the speakers. He weaved out of the way of another machine, approaching the front of the pack. Starting with the first barrier. The person farthest ahead halted. It had to be Todoroki. He was managing to close the gap. Looking up, however, it wasn't hard to figure out why. Robo Inferno! A mass of zero-pointers loomed over them. There had to be dozens, if not more, simply standing there ominously, menacingly. He was instantly filled with dread. Holy shit. He chastised his nerves. Now was not the time. He'd beaten one before, albeit it took everything he had, but he'd done it, so he'd just have to do it again. Again being about 10 more times. The leading robot lurched downwards, aiming one of its giant limbs towards the ground. He braced himself for the impact that would surely rock the course, but it never came. Instead, there was now a glistening glacier replacing the hunk of metal that stood there. If they weren't in the middle of a heated competition, he'd be pretty impressed by it, but it was that kind of seriousness that allowed him to catch the way the frozen robot teetered over, ever so slightly. He pivoted on his back heel, making a sharp turn towards the edges of the track as everyone else tried to take the opportunity to run between the robot's iced legs. Attempting to stay on pace, he made no effort to engage in the smaller robots that lunged towards him. Not only did he need to shorten his distance from Todoroki, but he needed to get the hell out of the area before that thing face-planted onto the earth. There was a piercing groan, followed by a metallic snap, and then the whole world just came crashing down. His scythe materialized again, and he made another desperate pole vault to get out of the way, just barely slipping by as the shock wave blew from behind him, sending him tumbling much farther and faster as expected. Yamada made some more comments, but Midoriya didn't pay any attention, too focused on the path ahead. That or his eardrums remained thoroughly blown out. 2 smaller robots and another zero-pointer stood in his way, and as the smoke cleared, they harshly locked onto him. There was no time for a plan. He just had to keep moving. He could see his classmates starting to gain a lead. People were recovering from the initial shock of that first robot going down. He couldn't waste the few seconds of an advantage he had. He dived under the first swing, just barely managing to graze the robot on his way with his uncovered hand. But that was all that was necessary, as it promptly shook and collapsed into a pile of scrap and dust. The other small robot, perhaps stunned by the immediate death of its comrade, whirled to chase as Midoriya zipped by. He tried to lose the machine following him, but its speed and tenacity proved to be a bit too forbidding, as he started to lose himself between him and the zero-pointer in front of him. He had to do something. The space was closing in, unless he wanted to be pancaked. He uncovered his other hand, stuffing that glove away too, so that all 10 of his fingertips could be active. The robot behind him was quickly approaching, which was certainly an unfortunate constraint, but at the speed it was going, he guessed it couldn't break all too well. So with a spin that would have surely twisted his ankle, had it not been for the absolute fury in his soul, he swung behind to face it, swinging his scythe along with him. The robot had no time to react as the blade carved cleanly through it, falling to the ground in 2 sparking pieces, no DT necessary. And then, without hesitation, he slammed the tips of his blade into the earth, once again rocketing himself upwards, straight at the zero-pointer. There was no other open path on the ground, not with all the behemoths in the way, so he'd just have to cut right through. The arc of his jump was nowhere near high enough to pass over the zero-pointer, but that was fine, exactly what he wanted even. He pushed his wrists together and spread his fingers out, hands outstretched in front of his face, trying to maximize the surface area. His veins buzzed with anticipation, his power rushed through them, burrowing in his fingertips, begging to be released by the very state of its being. And so he did, right as he made minuscule contact with the zero-pointer's cold metal skin. He shot right through the robot like a human bullet, piercing straight through its body and exiting out its back. His uniform and bits of skin were nicked by shards of metal and wires as he passed through, but none of it was major, not when his soul burned with such fervor. He resummoned his weapon as he fell. He was still fairly high up, and unless he wanted to splatter against the ground upon landing, he needed to slow his descent. The other zero-pointers behind the one he'd torn through were unprepared for his appearance, and as one tried to strike in mid-air, the lag in reaction easily allowed him to dodge, twisting his body almost unnaturally to miss its slow-moving fist. He took the opportunity to dig his scythe into its arm, and, fueled a little bit by DT, he cut down the surface of its side like butter. His fall slowed substantially from the added friction as he lessened the amount of DT flowing through his scythe, and once he was close enough to the ground, he simply jumped onto a rough tumble. Not the classiest way of going about a landing, but he wasn't a pile of blood and bones, so he'd take it as a plus. 1A's Todoroki slips by under, 1A's Bakugo flies up over, and 1A's Midoriya cuts straight through. What a trio! Present Mike exclaimed, the excitement in his voice mirroring the audience. Midoriya panted, trying to catch his breath and keep his pace. It was no surprise Bakugo was up front with them. He wouldn't doubt if he was seeing the hothead fueled by solely Todoroki's declaration in the prep room. His eyes caught onto something strange approaching, and he slowed himself slightly in caution. So the first barrier was a piece of cake? How about the second? The voice hero's smirk was audible. Fall and you're out. You gotta crawl across if you want to make it. And then he got a good look at just what it was. This is the fall. He skidded to a stop upon reaching the edge. Surrounding him were a series of raised platforms linked together by thin strands of metal cording. Peering into the void below, all he could see was never-ending darkness. He used the time to catch his breath, trying to think of how to best approach his new obstacle he was faced with. He cursed under his panting breath. This would be a huge time loss for him. He didn't have a reliable way to safely and quickly navigate over the abyss. Some of the jumps he could vault over, but he could tell right away that there were no paths where all the gaps were jumpable. But as the noise behind him grew louder, he knew he had no more time to think. He just had to have to figure it out when he got there. Just like before, his trusty weapon appeared in his hand, and he launched himself into yet another leap of faith. He flew and tumbled back onto the ground, just barely making it over as he kicked himself away from the edge. Damn it, he'd underestimated that first one, and it nearly cost him. He couldn't afford to make another mistake like that. So he got himself a running start this time, pouring his draining strength into his arms as he plowed the end of the scythe back down. His core screamed in agony as he hoisted himself back up into the air. He'd never needed to do vaults like this so consistently. It was starting to take its toll on his stamina. And as he landed on another platform, this time more comfortably in the center, he struggled to return to his feet. He could manage another. He had to. But not over that impossibly large gap that faced him. Damn it, what to do, what to do? There was no way he could make that jump, absolutely not. No look of determination in his spirit would help. He looked behind him. Students were catching up, some on the same path as him, crawling over ropes upside down. He could do that, but it would cost him precious time, though this section as a whole already had. He crouched down and gripped the base of the cording in one hand, feeling the cool touch of metal on his bare skin, and then he had a new idea. "Whoa!" Present Mike shouted. "What's 1A's Midoriya up to?" He should really be asking himself the same thing, as he disintegrated the latch that kept the rope anchored to his platform, practically ripping it out of the ground. He gripped it tightly in both hands. As he heard someone start to pull themselves onto his platform from another rope, he sucked in a breath. If he thought he wasn't making leaps of faith before, then he sure was making one now. He leapt off the edge, holding onto the cord for dear life, trying to keep his anxiety in check so he wouldn't decay his very lifeline. He smacked hard into the side of a new platform, the one that he could not even have thought about jumping to, but his grip remained as steely as the rope was. He removed one of his hands from the cord, straining as the other took hold of his full body weight and dug into the side of the platform, DT instinctually, rushing to carve out a space for his hand. Once he felt secure, which was more a matter of will than actual security, he let go of the rope completely and was reaching his free hand higher. An old trick out of his book was what he told himself, reminding him of how he scaled the zero-pointer at the first exam. It was funny how it came full circle, and here he was, scaling a slab of rock over a death pit instead. Incredible! 1A's Midoriya takes a shocking leap of faith, taking the only way across with him. Now everyone that took the same path as him is trapped. They'll have to head back and find a new route. It wasn't his intention, merely an unfortunate oversight. He hoped he hadn't impeded any of his classmates with his stunt. It was a competition, yes, but his humanity wanted to see them all make it to the next round regardless. He hoisted himself up over the edge, panting as sweat dripped off his face. Damn, there were still loads more platforms to cross in order to truly reach solid ground. He was lucky if he'd made it through half. He wiped the sweat from his brow. Well, he wasn't going to get across if he didn't try. The next gap was small enough, so he whipped out his scythe with a shaky set of arms and vaulted over again. It was a slow process, but he saved some time switching between jumping and scaling. Not that he really had a choice otherwise. His arms were on fire, practically begging for the torture to end. His core muscles threatened to heave out whatever he had for breakfast in rebellion. But he pushed down the pain. He was almost there, almost at the end of this god-forsaken hell zone. And our leader has reached the final barrier, the minefield. Crap, that had to be Todoroki. He was already at the end? He tuned out the rest of Present Mike's description that he had with a burning of new fire. He reached out for the ledge of his last jump and pulled himself over. He was still pretty far ahead of the crowd. He could still catch up. He reached the edge of the field, only to find students being launched into the air with loud bangs. It truly looked and felt like a war zone, completed with the distant sight of Todoroki and Bakugo battling it out for first. The field itself was wide, but upon closer inspection he could see the mines that rested just under the dirt. There had to be thousands, and if he tried to avoid each and every one, he'd never catch up in time. Think. If he had more firepower like Bakugo's explosions, he could simply propel himself over the field entirely, and while he'd been making do with some fancy pole vaulting, he knew that he couldn't push his arms any further, having tired them out completely with the last obstacle. Damn it. Now he was wishing that he'd practiced some more with recreating those blasts he used at the USJ. Think. There was a lot more mines up front, so since people were being much more cautious as they entered the field, they'd activate once they were stepped on, but didn't seem to blow up from the vibrations of people running around them. And they weren't too deep into the ground. Maybe he didn't need something fancy after all. His arms groaned at his scythe's weight, and his hold was shaky, but he focused every nerve he had into carefully using the tip of the blade to carve out one of the mines from the earth. People were passing him, confused, some being his own classmates, but he ignored them all. He was tunnel-visioned on making sure not one of these mines exploded on him, and he dug them out. Bakugo and Todoroki are about to cross the finish line. He looked at his pile. It wasn't as many as he hoped for, but it would have to do. He gritted his teeth, bracing himself for what was to come. This was his only chance, his last one, to try and take first. He raised his scythe far over his head. If it didn't work, at least he'd look cool trying. And he slammed it down with everything he had. A deafening explosion rocked the course, with students everywhere looking to see what caused such a noise. Amidst the smoke and flash, Midoriya sailed over the minefield, flying over tons of other students. His ears rang piercingly, his skin smoked, the ends of his uniform singed, and yet every single muscle in his body was suddenly rejuvenated. And Midoriya rides the wave in hot pursuit. He'd never felt so alive in his life. He watched as he quickly caught up to both Bakugo and Todoroki, and met their harsh gazes with his own, but no amount of fire in their eyes could stop him from sailing right over their heads. He's past them! His heart lifted at those words. He'd done it. Just a little further, and he would truly have first place. It would be his, though as he could hear the shouts behind him, Todoroki and Bakugo wouldn't make that easy. Our former leaders have called a ceasefire to chase down Midoriya. However, there was quickly another issue that was a bit more prominent than those two. He was rapidly approaching the ground, and he hadn't thought of his dismount. He felt himself stalling in the air as his arch neared its end. The other two were right on his tail, mere inches from him now. If he fell behind again, this was close to the finish line. There was no chance of recovery. He needed to stay in the lead, but landing here wouldn't give him enough time to recover. Midoriya righted himself in the air as Bakugo and Todoroki started to pull ahead of him. If he couldn't land now, then he just needed some more air time. He planted both of his feet hard into their backs, and in their moment of surprise, he lifted his hands high above, then pushed off of them like springboards, and sent his newly summoned scythe crashing down with an unholy momentum. For a second, there was only a series of clicks beneath them, but they all knew what entailed. A second, slightly smaller explosion rang out, sending Todoroki and Bakugo off to the side, and Midoriya barreling forward. And Midoriya blows off the competition with no time to lose. What are you teaching these kids, Eraser? But he paid no attention to his teacher's words. Tumbling into a rough roll to maintain his pace, he pushed forward. The end was just in sight. Who could have predicted such an incredible turn of events so early on? President Mike bellowed. The one who made it back to the stadium first is... Midoriya raced through the starting tunnel, grasping for the light at the end of it. None other than Midoriya Izuku! And the audience roared. He was almost unable to stop his gait, having to drag aching heels into the dirt. His heart was racing, adrenaline pumping, lungs just barely able to keep up. He rested his hands on his knees for a moment, watching the sweat pool beneath him, trying desperately to catch his breath before looking up. Everyone was cheering. Everyone was cheering for him. Midori! He turned around, not having noticed the other racers piling into the stadium just on his heels. It hadn't even been a minute since he entered, and yet it was easily filled with at least a dozen other students, and still pride flooded him like never before to see all these capable contenders and to know that he'd come out on top. Looking for the source of the cry, he missed Uraraka as she flung herself towards him, having just enough self-control not to barrel right into him. That was awesome! She exclaimed breathlessly, literally. Indeed, Ida was right behind her, though to lose a race of all things with my quirk, there is much I need to improve. Uraraka, Ida, he sighed, but she was too quick and beat him to it. First place, though, I'm so jealous. First place, huh? He'd really done it. He was all on his own and still managed to pull through with nothing but his own wit and strategies, his own strength and power, and for once there was nothing his own self-doubt could say about it. He was on such a high, so elated about his win, what felt like his first real win. It took more willpower than he thought that he had left just to refrain from bursting into tears. Well, I've got full faith that you'll turn out to be someone great, and if you're planning on going into heroics, then I'll just have to keep an ear out for you. Are you still watching, Ishihara-san? He wiped at his eyes, pretending to clear the sweat from his face. Because I did it. And everyone around him just seemed a bit lighter. So, it's finally over. Midnight gathered back everyone's attention. Let's check the results. The screen lit up, loading a list of names in order of placement. Midori's own held at the very first spot, and as he scanned down, he was surprised to see the names of all of his other classmates up there as well, along with one other name he recognized. Hatsume, he mumbled under his breath, not expecting to see her amongst the Hero Corps students. He was then reminded of the gloves in his pocket. He pulled them out and slipped them back on, shuddering at how dry and brittle his hands felt against the fabric. The top 42 will move on, but for those who placed lower, don't worry, we've got other ways for you to show your stuff. Midnight directed up the newly cleared-off screen with a dramatic gesture. Now, on to the second event. Next up is... The mess on the screen stopped abruptly, along with everyone's breaths. This. In big, bold lettering, the words Cavalry Battle were shown. Cavalry. So they had to team up after being pitted against one another. Midnight began explaining. Participants will form teams of 2 to 4 and get into a horse and rider formation. A crude example consisting of All Might and a few other heroes was shown on the screen. If Midoriya wasn't so out of breath, he would have snorted. The rules are fundamentally the same as any ordinary cavalry battle. Snag your opponent's headbands while protecting your own, but there's an exception. The list of qualifying names returned to the screen. Each of you has been assigned a point value based on your ranking in the last event. Midoriya could already see where this was going. Of course, the students who placed higher would be worth more, turning the capable into targets for everyone else to gang up on. Individual points values start at the bottom, at 5, so 42nd is worth 5, 41st is worth 10, and so forth. Simple enough, right? The heroine didn't bother waiting for a response. However, as the screen presented each participant's point value, it hesitated over the last and final name, Midoriya's. Our first-place participant is worth 10 million points. His heart stopped, but that was much more than all the other headbands put together. Whoever held this headband would be guaranteed first no matter what. He'd gotten himself into an all-or-nothing situation. The higher-ranked students are the ones to aim for, Midnight clarified, not that it needed to be. This survival game is a chance for a comeback. It's anyone's game. Everyone turned to stare at him, and he suddenly realized how alone he truly was. Just his luck. He drilled his fingers against the table he was sitting at, watching his monitor intently within the dark room. It was taking everything he had not to destroy the computer he was using to watch right here and now. He channeled his sputtery energy into his usual scratching, clawing away at his neck. Ugh, this was so infuriating. He didn't even know why he was watching this anymore. As Kurogiri would say, why continue putting himself through something that was so clearly bothering him? And to that, he wasn't all too sure. These UA kids, they were really pissing him off, sparking something primal deep within his hatred. But as to why he remained, it was a good question. And the screen changed angles. And then he saw him. Then it all made sense again. He wasn't surprised, really, watching him cross the finish line in a panting heap. He'd seen what he could do firsthand, and while it pissed him off then, now he was left to his own meager thoughts. After all this time, after all his thinking, he still didn't understand any more than the first time, so he'd wanted to see why. He wanted to see firsthand. That's why he'd turned on the stupid channel to begin with. What was he expecting, really? He listened as the audience roared with applause, and watched as he looked around stupendously, growing angrier the longer it went on. How had someone like him... Why had someone like him chosen this of all things? Why was someone like him doing this to himself when clearly he wasn't born to? He was just like himself, and people like him weren't meant for good things. He dug his nails into his neck. People like him weren't meant to be heroes. He pushed himself away from the table, needing to take a breath unless he wanted to explode. Every thought in his head was screaming either to turn off the monitor or straight up destroy it, and while he really wanted to do both, he instead did the opposite. He calmed himself, a feat unlike him, and returned to the screen. They were so alike, so much that it had unnerved him. Though it also left him with a gluttonous, insatiable curiosity for more. He was just like him, and yet he couldn't understand how they'd ended up so different. How was it possible? How was it fair? He needed to understand. Our truest mark, huh? A sick grin had stretched upon his face, and he laughed quietly to himself, eyes squinting from the harsh screen glow. He watched intently as the camera zoomed in on him, making sure to capture that elated expression of his after his victory. He looked so very happy. The glass on the table shattered into a million pieces as he suddenly grabbed it, feeling shards and dust slip from his hands. He couldn't wait to see it break. What will you do, Midoriya? Shigaraki couldn't wait to be the one to do it. When I leave mine upon this world. All right, everyone, this concludes Chapter 31 of Deku and Death. We finally made it to the Sports Festival chapters. I really like these ones a lot. I hope you guys enjoy them as well, and as always, thank you so much for listening.